Hello everyone, how's it going? It is Wednesday morning, it is 9:30, and I am here, or should I say, we are live to stream a meeting which, as you can see on the screen, has not started yet. So, I'm not going to be talking over this meeting this morning, I'm just here to do the introduction thing. Dominic Cummings is going to be answering questions from the Science and Technology Committee and also from the Health and Social Care Committee on the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and any lessons which have been learned by government during the pandemic. Now, it is expected that Dominic Cummings is going to tell the world all about Boris Johnson's herd immunity plan. So, yeah, this could be a very interesting meeting. I mean, we don't often get things that are very interesting happening in the House of Commons. This this is one of the times where something interesting does happen. So I decided that I would stream it live because I know there's people that are subscribed to this channel who like watching stuff like this live and like knowing what's happening in the world of politics. I also thought it would be good to just play this on.
The proceeding will start shortly.
Prime Minister's questions, It seems like a good idea to make a day of it. So that's what I'm doing here.
The proceeding will start shortly.
Waiting for this to start. As you can see there, you maybe can't see it there, but the portcullis is moving. That means that the meeting is starting anyway.
Shortly.
So the sitting was supposed to start at 9:30 on the button. Now I see on the television that the meeting has started, so I'm expecting to see the meeting coming through here.
Order. The committee is now in session. The Science and Technology Committee and the Health and Social Care Select Committees are undertaking a joint inquiry into the lessons that can be learned from the UK's response to the COVID pandemic. The public inquiry, which the Prime Minister has announced, will most likely take evidence and report well after most of the pandemic is over. Our inquiry, we hope, will be complementary to this, being focused on lessons that can be learned already and which can be applied during the months ahead to benefit decisions that have to be taken during those months ahead. And, of course, the evidence that we gather in our inquiry will be available to the public inquiry. We will hear from the Health Secretary in 2 weeks' time, just over 2 weeks, on the 10th of June, after which we will make our report to Parliament. Just a word on how we'll organise this morning's proceedings. This is a hybrid meeting, with some members of the Joint Committee joining remotely and some in person. We'll have 4 sections. The first about the early days of the pandemic, which I will chair. My colleague Jeremy Hunt will then chair a discussion on lockdown measures and the performance of test and trace. I will then chair a section on vaccines. And finally, Jeremy will chair the final section on the lockdowns of the autumn and winter period. We'll have a short pause between these sections during which time the cameras will be briefly turned off. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dominic Cummings, the Chief Advisor to the Prime Minister from July 2019 to November 2020. Good morning, Mr Cummings, and thank you for offering to appear. Perhaps I could start with some general questions about the background to the COVID pandemic before turning to my colleagues. In your Rose Garden statement, you said, "For years I've warned of the dangers of pandemics. Last year I wrote about the possible threat of coronaviruses and the urgent need for planning." And indeed, your blog of March 2019 warned of escapes of viruses from labs in Asia as posing, and I quote, "a real danger of a worldwide pandemic that could kill human beings on a vast scale." So, given this context, on the 22nd of January, Wuhan, a city the size of London by population, was sealed off from the rest of the world. On the 30th of January, the WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern. Given what you'd thought about this over the years past, did this set alarm bells ringing, and did you think what you'd thought about in advance was happening?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's right that the publicly selected representatives are trying to figure out what happened and the lessons to be learned. I hope you'll get all the senior people involved in here to speak to you about it. The truth is that senior ministers, senior officials, senior advisors like me fell disastrously short of the standards that the public has a right to expect of its government in a crisis like this. When the public needed us most, the government failed. And I'd like to say to all the families of those who died unnecessarily, how sorry I am for the mistakes that were made and for my own mistakes at that. Regarding the beginning of this crisis, yes, you're right that that I, like many people, had talked about this before. When it started in January, I did think, in part of my mind, oh my goodness, is this it? Is this what people have been warning about all of this time? However, at the time, the PHE here and the WHO and the sort of the CDC, generally speaking, organisations across the Western world, were not kind of ringing great alarm bells about it then. I think it's, in retrospect, completely obvious that many institutions failed on this early question. But the truth is, I can't remember the precise date, but I think the Taiwanese government basically hit the panic button on something like New Year's Eve of 2019. It might not be the exact date, but within a few days. And they put into effect a plan which they'd figured out from having been terrified of previous outbreaks like SARS and whatnot. And they immediately closed the borders, they introduced very strict quarantine systems, they did a whole bunch of things right off the bat in January. But I think it's obvious that the Western world, including Britain, just completely failed to see the smoke and to hear the alarm bells in January. There's no doubt about it.
Was there a time? Do you remember a time when you personally were seized of the importance of it?
Well, I talked to people in January about it. On something like the 25th of January, I said to the private office in number 10 that we should look at pandemic planning. I said that I wanted to go up to Portland Down and talk to some of the people up there about it. I think at the same day, possibly one day before or after, I said to Matt Hancock, where are we in terms of scanning the pandemic preparations plans? Are we completely up to speed on this? Is it resourced the way that it should be, etc., etc.?
So that was about the 25th of January.
Do you want to get the exact date?
If you have it.
It was 25th of January on both things. 25th of January I spoke to private office, and 25th of January I said to the Secretary of State.
When you said, was that a conversation or was that a memo or a text?
So I've got the exact words of a text that I sent him. I think I spoke to him that day, possibly the next day, at a meeting about it as well. I said, quote, "To what extent have you investigated preparations for something terrible like Ebola or a flu pandemic? Please ensure we take a risk-averse approach to funding preparations in the SR." SR's abbreviation for spending review. Right. "I'm going to dig into this plus bioterror," to which Hancock replied, "We've got full plans up to and including pandemic levels, regularly prepped and refreshed, CMOs and epidemiologists. We're stress testing now. It's our top tier risk register. We had an SR bid before this." I replied, "Great, I'm reading about the CDC and preparations for a flu pandemic. It's very worrying."
Right.
So
the 25th of January, you instigated a set of inquiries within the system. Would you?
Yes.
Would you
However,
be able to?
I'd like to stress, though, that I'd like to stress and apologise for the fact that it is true that I did this, but I did not. I did not follow up on this and push it the way that I should have done. We were told in number 10 at the time, this is literally top of the risk register. This has been planned and there's been exercises on this over and over again. Everyone knows exactly what to do. And it's sort of tragic and in a way that someone who wrote so often about running red teams and not trusting things and not digging into things whilst I was running red teams on lots of other things in government at this time, I didn't do it on this. And it's if I'd said at the end of January, we're going to take a Saturday and I want all of these documents put on the table and I want it all gone through and I want outside experts here to look at it all, then we'd have figured out much, much earlier that all the claims about brilliant preparations and how everything was in order were basically completely hollow. But we didn't figure this out until the back end of February.
Thank you. We'll come on to more detailed aspects of that. In terms of those texts that you referred to that first documented your concerns and your involvement, would you share them with the committee after the meeting?
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, there were, just to be clear, there were conversations about it earlier, I mean, before that in January in Number 10, because it was periodically on the news. It would sort of flare up and be big news and then it would die out again. So I don't want to imply that was the first time that Number 10 talked about it, because that's not the case. There were conversations in Number 10 about it right in the first week back in January.
When we talk about Number 10, there are lots of people that work in Number 10. When did you talk to the Prime Minister about it first?
It was definitely raised with the Prime Minister in the first half of January for sure, because it was on the news.
And did you have a conversation with him about it?
Yes.
When would that be?
First half of January.
And was that was a chat, a conversation rather than
just general
exchange?
Chat with me and other people.
Yeah, I see. During the months that followed, was COVID the most important matter that you dealt with from January onwards?
It sort of depends what you mean. I mean, retrospectively, it was the most important issue, obviously, but at the time...
How did it feel at the time?
The government... in no way, shape or form did the government act like in January like it was the most important thing. It didn't act like it was the most important thing in February, never mind in January.
Well, what proportion of your time would you say, perhaps in those early months, February, for example, what proportion of your time was devoted to it in February?
In January, not very much. In February, a lot. Of my personal time, a lot more.
More than half, or less than that?
I would say the first half of February, probably less than half. After the reshuffle, which I think was the 12th or something like that, more than half.
And then that increased, did it, after that?
By the last week by roughly the last 10 days of February, it was over 90% of what I was personally spending my time on, though there were other things kind of floating in and out. But it was certainly not, I think this is a really important point to register. The government itself and Number 10 was not operating on a war footing in February on this in any way, shape or form. Lots of key people were literally skiing in the middle of February. It wasn't until the last week of February that there was really any sort of sense of urgency, I would say, across the in terms of Number 10 in the Cabinet Office.
Would you say that you were operating on a war footing in February?
As I said before, I think in the first 10 days or so of February, no, because there were all sorts of things going on. There was the HS2 nightmare, there was the reshuffle going on, and then that happened on the 12th, and then the PM went away on holiday for 2 weeks. And then after that, I didn't go on holiday. I was in Downing Street throughout that period, and I spent more and more of my time on it. However, and again, I want to apologise for this. I didn't. Obviously, in retrospect, I should have been hitting the panic button far more than I was in February. I did increasingly hit the panic button as February went on. But I, like most people, I think were wrongly reassured by things like the WHO and about what we were being told internally.
Well, the WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern on the 30th of January. So the WHO was not giving reassurance, quite the opposite. They
did say that, but it wasn't. after the 30th of January, it was not at all seen in Whitehall that there was going to be a pandemic.
I'm talking about Whitehall, I'm talking about what's going on around the world. We had TV pictures of Wuhan being sealed off, reports of people's doors being welded shut.
Yeah.
Were you not aware of that at that time, towards the end of January? Right.
Yes, was aware.
And you weren't on a war footing, and you've explained that's something that you regret. Just kind of finally on this, you said that it didn't occupy the majority of your time during February, it increased over time. Just give a brief summary of what were the other things that you were dealing with, what were the principal demands in your time during February?
There was, I was working very much on the whole kind of science and technology agenda. I was working on procurement reform. Ironically, in January and early Feb, one of the things that I spent most of my own time on was trying to get to grips with the procurement system. We ended up having to, and I had regular weekly meetings in the cabinet room on procurement in January and February to try and get to grips with the nightmare of that whole thing. Ironically, that was completely overtaken by the COVID. We had to bin the procurement meetings that I was running because of the procurement problems with COVID, if you see what I mean.
So science,
planning, procurement, science and
anything
technology.
else?
There were various national security issues that I was dealing with in February. But essentially, there was kind of the first 10 days of February, which were HS2, reshuffle, various things like that. And then the Prime Minister and other people went off on holiday. And then I was dealing with some of those things from the 12th, but then increasingly with COVID in the second half of the last 2 weeks of February.
Okay.
I also sent, so after the election, I hired a guy, a physicist called Ben Warner, and brought him into Number 10 to try and start to build a proper data and analytical office in Number 10, because one of the great problems that Number 10 had in 2019 when I was there was a huge lack of these kind of skills.
So that was taking time.
So I brought him in. I sent him off to start attending the SAGE meetings.
Let's come on to that, because I want to ask some questions about SAGE meetings, everyone. I want to leave time for comments on this. So just again, some contextual questions. Obviously, you're not just the advisor, but the chief advisor to the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Did you have to book meetings with him, or did you, as it were, pop in and out of his office?
I would just pop in and out of his office.
You sat literally outside the door, I think. Is that right?
Effectively, yes. Not literally, but yes.
Right. And did you write notes to him as well, or was it through that kind of informal popping into the office?
I sometimes wrote notes, but most of our interaction was talking.
Did you write any notes to him about the COVID situation during January and February?
I did in February. I'm not sure if I did in January.
Did you keep a copy of it?
I can check exactly what I said to him in February in terms of things that were written down.
And if you have it, will you share it with the committee?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. What about? So you were there sitting outside the office. You sent at least one note. Did you use text and WhatsApp with thoughts on?
Yes.
On the pandemic there? Have you kept copies of those during that period?
Not all, but lots, yes.
Okay. Can you share those that are relevant to what the response to COVID was during that period?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. And just finally on some of the meetings, COBRA is the principal emergency response apparatus of the government. It met on the 24th of January, so
yes.
Before the WHO had raised its international alert. It met another 4 times in the 5 weeks before the month of March. Did you go to those COBRA meetings?
I'm not sure now if I attended the COBRA meetings. I don't think that I did. What I did was I sent, as I said before, I hired a guy to run data for Number 10.
But was that did you choose not to go, or were you stopped from going?
So it was a question of basically dividing up different people's time. So what I did was I sent Ben Warner, the data scientist, and Imran, who was the Prime Minister's personal secretary, who dealt with the NHS and the whole COVID thing. So mainly speaking in February, those two attended COBRA meetings.
The
Ben
5
Warner,
meetings. Do you remember whether you attended any COBRA meeting in February?
I don't remember.
Right. Did you advise the Prime Minister that he should go to the COBRA meetings?
No, I did not.
Why, given this is the principal body that brings all of the security people, the health security people, the intelligence people together, why didn't you go, and why didn't you advise the Prime Minister to go?
Well, as I say, I didn't go because it was a better use of everyone's time for Ben Warner and for Imran to actually attend those meetings. I spoke and had briefings one-to-one with Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Advisor, and with Chris Whitty about specific things. Lots of COBRA meetings are basically just sort of going through PowerPoint slides and are not massively useful.
So that was your take, that COBRA wasn't worth your time?
No, it was not that COBRA wasn't worth my time, but in terms of what was the best use of everybody's time, the best use of everybody's time was to have... Ben Warner was actually a scientist, so he attended the SAGE meetings in February on behalf of Number 10, for which there's been some criticism, but I think it was absolutely the right decision that I took to do that. And he and Imran attended the COBRA meetings. I was briefed one-to-one by Patrick and by Chris and by other people where I could dig into a lot of other questions. Also bear in mind, one of the huge problems we had throughout was things leaking and causing chaos in the media.
Leaking from COBRA?
Leaking from COBRA, leaking from practically everything. And so when I wanted to have sensitive conversations that I didn't want to see appear in the media, I did not have those conversations in COBRA. I had those conversations
just pause on that. So you're saying that the meeting, the most secure meeting in Whitehall, literally named after a room, the Cabinet Office briefing room, where you've got to leave your phone outside, it's swept for bugs. That meeting was so insecure that you didn't feel that you could speak candidly at it. You said you were concerned about leaks. That's presumably the implication.
Certainly. I mean, you can just look at the record. I mean, the meetings of the Excess Committee, which was supposedly the secret negotiation committee for Brexit, which operated out of the COBRA rooms at my request from summer 2019, leaked like a sieve continually.
Okay. So you had COBRA, which was nominally the fulcrum of the response.
Yes.
But you didn't go, the Prime Minister didn't go. You said on one of your tweets this week that if we'd had competent people in charge, we probably could have avoided lockdown 1. But you and the Prime Minister didn't consider yourself to be relevant to that meeting. Was there another meeting, or were you not the most competent, relevant people?
Well, as I said, I was having meetings about it, but I was having meetings with people like Patrick, by myself, or with 2 or 3 other people in a forum where I knew that they wouldn't leak. Lots of the COBRA meetings are quite formulaic. In terms of the Prime Minister, the basic thought was that in February, the Prime Minister regarded this as just a scare story. He described it as the new swine flu.
Did you tell him it wasn't?
Certainly. But the view of various officials inside Number 10 was, if we have the Prime Minister chairing COBRA meetings and he just tells everyone it's swine flu, don't worry about it, I'm going to get Chris Whitty to inject me live on TV with coronavirus so everyone realises it's nothing to be frightened of, that would not help actually serious planning.
Okay, but you talk about people in Number 10 and you described the dysfunctionality of COBRA. You're not just a person in Number 10. You are literally, your title was the Chief Advisor, Actually, that wasn't, with respect, that actually wasn't my title. My title was Assistant to the Prime Minister. Right.
But,
so you didn't consider yourself to be the most senior person in Number 10?
Well, I mean, I'm not the most senior person in Number 10. The Cabinet Secretary is the most senior person, and the Principal Private Secretary runs his office. I mean, obviously, I had an influential role.
You didn't have the authority to be able to... you write, and often persuasively, about the need to to avoid sort of tram lines and groupthink. You talked about a red team that's challenging the consensus.
Yeah.
When you noted that the COBRA meetings were not useful meetings, didn't you have the authority in Downing Street to be able to point this out and call for change?
No.
To change it?
No, there's lots of my authority to change things in Downing Street is extremely limited. I mean, bear in mind, at the beginning of January, I tried extremely hard to have a huge office reorganisation because, as you guys will know yourselves, the whole number 10 building is completely hopeless in terms of a working environment. I tried in January to get everybody to move to create a whole new office system so that we could actually be more effective, and I completely lost the argument. So there are all sorts of things I tried to do which, for better or worse, I did not win the argument on.
I understand. Just finally, in terms of this background, we talked about COBRA. What about SAGE? SAGE met for the first time on the 22nd of January, then it met very frequently after that. Did you attend routinely the meetings of SAGE?
I attended, I wouldn't say routinely, I attended some of them. I sent Ben Warner to attend all of them, and he did.
Did you have the right to attend? You delegated to Ben Warner, but could you have gone yourself if you wanted?
I could have done, yes.
Yeah, I see.
But again, I took the view that, so in a sense it's a slightly opposite problem of COBRA, whereas lots of COBRA meetings are just sort of reading out PowerPoints. The SAGE meetings, quite a lot of those are technical, involving technical questions, and I am not a technical person, I'm not a smart person, I couldn't understand a lot of the models and things like that were being discussed. Ben Warner's
anyone reading your blogs would say
training,
that you had a facility with technical terms and discussions.
That's wrong. That's not a good description of me at all. I sent Ben precisely because, and I involved and brought in outsiders from the academic world and from business later on, precisely because I couldn't understand a lot of the things that were being discussed and I couldn't understand the modelling that was being done. So I thought it was far better to have a PhD physicist there who could actually properly look at the documents and really understand what was being said. That he had a lot more to contribute to that than I did. Now, I listened to lots of the conversations in February and March, but a lot of it was over my head.
But you write a lot about the dangers of groupthink and people going on tram lines, and precisely experts talking to each other and insiders talking to each other. The fact that you consider yourself an outsider on that, didn't it make it more important from your own writings and perspective to be able to be there to make sure that they weren't going onto
that's exactly why I sent that's exactly why I sent Ben from number 10, and it's exactly why I listened to some of the meetings and attended some of them myself.
Okay. We're going to come on.
It's also why I brought in outsiders to the process later on.
We're going to come on to talk about the question of herd immunity, whether or not that was the policy, and Jeremy's going to ask some questions on that. But finally, I mentioned your blog and the fact that you've been thinking for some time about specifically virus escapes and the consequences of pandemics. Why did you change your 2019 blog between April and May 2020 to refer to coronaviruses?
Well, there's been a lot of funny things written about this. There's lots of media stories saying that I changed what I wrote, but those stories are all false. Not a single letter of what I wrote in 2019 was ever changed. In 2019, I wrote a blog that said, here is a huge problem, these gain-of-function experiments being done all over the world. Here is this big piece in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists explaining it. So I wrote a blog, and then I quoted a big chunk of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists thing, and then I wrote underneath, here's what I think about it, and this should be taken more seriously in Whitehall. Not a single letter of what I wrote was changed. What happened was I think it was May, sometime in the summer, not particularly important, after the first wave had happened, I was extremely confident and turned out to be completely wrong that the whole question about a lab leak would be shortly a massive issue, because I thought that Trump was going to make it a massive issue in the election against Biden, given that Obama's administration had funded some of the gain-of-function experiments in Wuhan itself. And I went back and looked at the Bulletin of Atomic Sciences piece that I'd originally quoted and said people should read this. And in that piece, it actually has a section on Wuhan itself and the BSL-2, BSL-3, BSL-4 facilities there. And I thought, geez, I sort of half remembered, half forgotten the whole thing. It was about a year before. I'm going to basically go back to the Bulletin of Atomic Science piece and paste a much bigger section than I did originally back on my blog. Because once Trump and everyone starts going on about this, everyone's going to be asking about it and seeing where did this argument come from and whatnot. And I wanted people to realise this isn't some weird thing that's just popped up. People were ringing alarm bells about this a year ago.
But therefore
just to stress, not a single word of what I wrote was changed. All I did was paste over the bulletin, more from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists.
So you changed the blog by adding to it things that you thought were of current interest.
Correct.
Right. So that's clear. But the time that you did it, do you remember when you did it? It was between April and May of 2020. We know. Do you remember?
It was reasonably shortly after I'd come back to work after being ill. So I came back to work on the 12th, 13th of April. Sometime I think over the next few weeks, because we were discussing the issue was starting to bobble around, and there were meetings about it in slide number 10.
So wasn't that a pretty intense period? Did you have the leisure to be changing, to adding to your blog posts of a previous year?
Well, as I said, I thought wrongly that it was going to become a massive issue, and I knew that everyone would start Googling the whole thing, and I wanted people to realise that people had been hitting the panic button about this a year earlier, and I thought it would be useful. I mean, if you look back at everything that I've written over the last 10 years, I've written over and over again about the problems like pandemics, natural or engineered, about crises, about the number 10 system. It frankly never occurred to me, given that I wrote tens of thousands of words about it, that people would get so head up about the whole thing. I just thought it was very useful for people to realise. And as you've seen in the news recently, there's now all sorts of things starting to come out from classified American sources suggesting that actually there were people ill with COVID in the Wuhan lab back in November. So I was completely wrong about the timing of it, but I do think it's a very important issue that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. It's not to say it's not interesting, but the tens of thousands of words that you wrote were not at a time when you were employed in public service to handle the most important emergency that the country has faced since the war.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand.
You say that the blog contains your reflections over the years. The tens of thousands of words that you wrote were written at times when you weren't employed in the role that you had during that time. I was perhaps expressing surprise that you had the time to be able to think about adding to or updating your blog when there were, as we'll probably come on to talk about, some pressing operational issues.
I went back and reread the Bulletin of Atomic, but also bear in mind, at the time, this was an actual live issue. It's not just a sort of historical thing. When I went back to number 10 after the 12th, there were meetings in there then asking, is this engineered? Is it not engineered? Has it escaped from the lab? Has it not? What are the implications of all of this? So there were meetings with the Prime Minister, the National Security Team and whatnot about that question. Then I obviously can't go into any of the details about that, but it was a live issue. So I went back and reread not just that piece, but lots of pieces. Pasting over text into a blog takes 90 seconds. It's not like this was something that's lengthy. I mean, it's literally something that takes a minute or so.
Okay, let's move on to this question of the policy or not of herd immunity.
Yeah.
Jeremy's going to lead the question on this, but just in handing over, just set out for us what I think you've referred to as being a crucial week, the week beginning Monday, the 9th of March. Just give us a brief summary of what happened in terms of the key meetings that week, and then Jeremy will have some questions on it.
Would it be useful if I explain what the sort of the thinking about herd immunity now, or would?
Yeah, I'll hand over to Jeremy now.
Yep, please go ahead.
So I think that there's obviously lots of confusion in the term can be used and is used differently by different people to mean different things. Essentially, the logic of the official plan from the Department of Health was that this disease is going to spread. Vaccines are not going to be relevant in any way, shape or form over the relevant time period. We were told it was essentially a certainty that there would be no vaccines available in 2020. Something else which turned out to be completely wrong, because as I think we'll come on to, it actually turns out we could have done vaccines much faster than happened, and that we thought at the time. But at the time, the whole plan was based on the assumption that it was a certainty that there would be no vaccines in 2020. So the logic was, you can either have, if it's unconstrained, it will come in and there'll be a sharp peak like that, and it will completely swamp everything, and huge disaster. The logical approach, therefore, is to introduce measures which delay that peak arriving and which push it down below the capacity of the health system. In response to the argument, but hang on a second, look at what they're doing in Wuhan, look at what they're doing in Taiwan, look at what they're doing in Singapore, look at what they're doing in South Korea. The entire assumption in Whitehall was, first of all, that won't work for them, and they will all have second peaks later on. Secondly, it's inconceivable that the British public are going to accept Wuhan-style measures here. Even if we therefore suppress it completely, all that you're going to do is get a second peak in the winter when the NHS is already every year under pressure. So we only actually have a real choice between one peak and herd immunity by September, terrible, but then you're through it by the time the next winter comes. If you try and flatten it now, this second peak comes up in wintertime. That's even worse than the summer. So horrific as the numbers look in the summer, the numbers will be even worse if this happens in October, November, December time. So it's important to bear in mind this on this whole herd immunity point. Obviously, no one is saying that they want this to happen. The point is, it was seen as an inevitability. You will either have herd immunity by September after a single peak, or you will have herd immunity by January with a second peak. Those are the only two options that we have. That was the whole logic of all of the discussions in January and February and early March. And that's why, in the week of the 9th, people from SAGE and elsewhere in the government started to talk publicly about herd immunity. It's not that people are thinking this is a good thing and we actively want it. It's that it's a complete inevitability. The only real question is one of timing. It's either herd immunity by September or it's herd immunity by January after a second peak. That was the assumption up until Friday the 13th of March.
So when Matt Hancock said on the 15th of March, we have a plan, herd immunity is not part of it, was that wrong?
Yes, and saying it's not part of it is completely wrong. I think there's a sort of semantic problem now that, and I look back through all of our WhatsApps between me and the Prime Minister and Hancock and Chris Valence and whatnot. Essentially, there's a sort of semantic question about, is the goal herd immunity? Do we want herd immunity? Versus, is that the basic plan? Of course, no one wants this to happen. No one wanted any of it to happen. But the point was, herd immunity was regarded as an unavoidable fact. It was the only question that we practically had was one of timing. So, I mean, we can go through the chronology of it, but after some SAGE members said on the 11th publicly, well, you know, we're going to be shielding people, and then by the time they come out of shielding, the rest of the population will have herd immunity. That was the plan. I'm completely baffled as to why Number 10 is trying to deny that, because that was the official plan. You can see it in the COBRA documents that I brought along. Hancock himself and the chief scientist and the chief medical officer were all briefing senior journalists during the week of the 9th. This is what the official plan is.
So let me ask you about the SAGE meeting on the 5th of March, which the minutes say you were at. Now, at that point on the 5th of March, it was 5 weeks since the WHO had said COVID was a public health emergency of international concern, and countries like China, Taiwan, Korea, even Australia and New Zealand were starting to lock their borders down, set up test and trace programs, stop mass events. But the minutes of that 5th of March meeting say that the only measures recommended were shielding the vulnerable and elderly. At that point, on the 5th of March, did you advise the Prime Minister that SAGE was wrong?
No, I didn't. So I was ringing increasing alarm bells in the first half of March, but I had a sort of my thought process was, so I started getting people coming to me round about the 25th of February saying, very smart people saying to me, America is completely screwing this up. You should be really aggressive. Don't listen to all these people saying that, you know, there's no alternative to this. I personally am starting to take preparations. I'm buying things. We're going to have to lock down, etc., etc. But the official view all the way through the first half of March and actually into the week of the 16th of March was that would all be more dangerous. Now, my mindset was, I was really torn about the whole thing, because in the first 10 days of March, I was increasingly being told by people, I think this is going wrong. But I was also really, really worried about kind of like smashing my hand down on a massive button marked, ditch the official plan, stop listening to the official plan. I think that there's something going wrong. Now, I did do that, as we'll come on to, but around about the 5th, I was still reluctant to do that, and we were exploring lots of different things that were going on.
So just to be clear, that was 2 weeks before the Champions League event in Liverpool, the Cheltenham Gold Cup.
Yes.
And you didn't, at that point, advise that those mass participation sports events should be cancelled?
No. And in fact, our official advice at the time was, and this shows the kind of logic at play, the official advice at the time was, doing that, A, won't really make much difference to transmission, which seems obviously bizarre in retrospect, the idea that we would keep having mass events going on through this whole thing. But also, secondly, it could be actively bad because you'll just push people into pubs. And of course, no one in the kind of official system in Department of Health drew the obvious logical conclusion, which was, well, shouldn't we be shutting all the pubs as well? The kind of, at this point, round about the 5th, the logic was, oh yeah, well, obviously, given we're not going to be closing pubs and closing retail and closing leisure and all of this, then I sort of see the point of the official advice. Because if you're not going to do those things, it does have a logic to it. Now, of course, the logic itself was completely flawed, but that's what the thinking was around the 5th of March.
So let's talk about the weekend when the plan did change. So this morning you tweeted a picture of a whiteboard from the Prime Minister's study of what you call Plan B, and you said you showed that to him on the morning of Saturday, the 14th of March.
Yeah.
Was that the moment that you told him for the first time that the scientific consensus, as we saw in those earlier SAGE meetings, was wrong?
No, it wasn't the first time. So the data scientist Ben Warner was working in Number 10. His brother, coincidentally and thankfully, was working with the NHS to help the NHS with building a whole data system and data dashboard to deal with COVID. He came to me on the 7th of March, and he had been in various meetings about the official plan. And he said to me, I'm really, really worried about this. It seems to me that people, this plan could easily be mad. It could be incredibly destructive. Like, has this really been tested? Have you really thought it all through? Should I and some others start thinking about plan B?
But when did you tell the Prime Minister that we needed to change direction?
So on the morning of the 12th,
right.
I said, there's all sorts of different things.
But the morning of the 12th, that's a Thursday, wasn't it? That was the first time you told the Prime Minister the scientific consensus is wrong, we need a plan B.
So on the night of the 11th, I texted the group with the Prime Minister and the Chief Scientific Advisor, and I said, people can see the trajectory and how social distancing will be needed to flatten the curve. Very sensible people, including former CDC officials, etc., and doctors are saying the risks of delay are much, much higher than the risks of going too soon. If we're not going to say tomorrow, starting social distancing today, we're waiting, and effectively just keep telling people to wash hands, there's going to be massive pushback saying, why wait 5 days? Why not move now? Why not flatten earlier? Proposing tomorrow that we delay action until next week will require extremely clear justification with supporting data, models, etc. We'd have to make it public for global scrutiny. So this is on the night of the 11th. This is because, and this is why I and others had this kind of mounting panic about the whole thing.
Were there people in SAGE who shared your view that we were going in the wrong direction, or was there a groupthink that was broadly shared by everyone?
As far as I can tell, as far as I can tell, and as far as I remember, most people in SAGE thought, this fundamental logic was still operative on the 11th and the 12th in SAGE. And this is the reason why I'd been reluctant over the previous week to tell the Prime Minister, I think the advice that we're getting is wrong. Even around the 11th and 12th, as far as I could tell from SAGE, and as far as the minutes show, the fundamental assumption remained, we can't do lockdown and we can't do suppression because it just means a second peak later. So on the night of the 11th, I warned, I sent that message and said, if we're not going to... So on the 11th, it became clear that, which became a running feature of the whole thing, that contrary to our expectations, all sorts of things which we thought were in train actually were not in train. So on the 11th, there was pushback from within the system against advising the following day, i.e. the 12th, to say stay at home if you've got symptoms. And me and others were realising at this point the system is basically delaying announcing all of these things because there's not a proper plan in place. And the justification is, it doesn't really matter if it's now or in a week's time. But actually, if the whole logic doesn't work, and essentially these things have been delayed simply because there hasn't been the planning and the preparation made. I wanted us to announce on the 12th, the individuals stay at home, and also to push through the household quarantine as well.
Let me just ask you briefly, how do we stop that happening in the future? Because there was a consensus about the way to do things. We know now with the benefit of hindsight that was wrong, but how would you change the structures and systems to prevent that kind of thing happening for a future pandemic?
I mean, that's obviously a huge question. I think there's absolutely no doubt at all that the process by which SAGE was secret, and overall the whole thinking around the strategy was secret, was an absolutely catastrophic mistake, because it meant that there wasn't proper scrutiny of the assumptions behind and the underlying logic behind it. Actually, SAGE agreed about this. When I said on the 11th, we're going to have to make all these models public and whatnot, there wasn't pushback from SAGE, and there wasn't pushback from Patrick Vallance either. Patrick actually agreed with me. And when I said we should just publish the code for the models so people can actually play with the code themselves and see what the hell these models are, Patrick also agreed and said to SAGE that we should do that. The problem is, by the time we were doing this, it was too late. By the 11th to 12th, we'd already gone terribly wrong. Now, if you see this document here, in terms of your previous question, Jeremy,
what are the documents?
This is from a COBRA document and a dashboard document. It actually was in various documents over this time period. I put it on my Twitter feed, but it has this graph here. This was the logic from SAGE, and this was the logic in the Department of Health at the time. You see, the black line there is do nothing. The blue line there is do a little bit. The green line is do a kind of Wuhan style, not necessarily Wuhan, but in that direction, suppression essentially. And as it says, very stringent social behavioural interventions, such as those in China, have the potential to prevent major epidemic establishment, but risks large epidemic re-establishing. The advised approach seeks to avoid this possibility. So this is actually after the crucial meetings on the 13th and the 14th. This graph kept appearing 15th, 16th, 17th. This remained the official logic for days.
You've described the behavioural scientists who advised SAGE on Spy B, I think it was, as charlatans, and be very critical of the advice they got about how people would react to a lockdown. Did you at the time commission research to challenge that view?
So we definitely did challenge it. Just to correct that, I didn't say that everybody involved with Spy B were charlatans, and that's not the case. The problem is that in this field of behavioural science, there are a lot of charlatans. And anybody who's been involved with the political world knows that the whole field is riddled with duff studies, memes that people believe are true but aren't true. And there's no doubt whatsoever that this actually was a critical part of the false groupthink. One of the critical things that was completely wrong in the whole official thinking in SAGE and in the Department of Health in February, March was the British public will not accept a lockdown. Secondly, the British public will not accept what was thought of as a kind of East Asian style track and trace type system and the infringements of liberty around that. Those two assumptions were completely central to the official plan and were both obviously completely wrong. And in the first half of March, this was raised sometimes in the Prime Minister's office, and me and others were literally pointing at the TV screen of Lombardy and saying, "Look at what's happening in Lombardy. We are getting text messages on our own phones from our own family saying what's going on." This assumption that the public won't, basically aren't that frightened and don't want to have a lockdown is false, and we should abandon it. But there's no doubt that was an extremely important thing.
Two final questions from me about that period. So on Monday the 16th of March, the Prime Minister did announce a change of tack and people were advised to socially distance, but pubs and restaurants were not closed, mass sports events were not stopped. Did you advise that we should be going further at that point, or did you go along with that softer version of the lockdown?
So can I backtrack, because I think we need to understand the crucial period between the Thursday the 12th and the Sunday when things started to change. So on the 12th, we started. It was a completely surreal day because. So I sent a message to the Prime Minister at 7:48 that morning, and forgive the language that this is expressed in, but I might as well just say what I actually said. We've got big problems coming. The Cabinet Office is terrifyingly shit, no plans, totally behind the pace. We must announce today, not next week. If you feel ill with cold or flu, stay home. Some around the system want to delay because they haven't done the work. We must force the pace. We're looking at 100 to 500,000 deaths between optimistic and pessimistic scenarios. You've got to chair the daily meetings in the Cabinet room, not COBRA, because the COBRA system just couldn't work. We couldn't get all the data in properly. It didn't work for a kind of open thing. So that's how the day started off, with us thinking, okay, today is going to be all about COVID and whether or not we're going to announce the household quarantine. We then got completely derailed because in the morning of the 12th, suddenly the national security people came in and said, Trump wants us to join a bombing campaign in the Middle East tonight. And we need to start having meetings about that through the day with COBRA as well. So everything to do with COBRA that day on COVID was completely disrupted because you had these two parallel sets of meetings. You had the national security people running in and out talking about, are we going to bomb the Middle East? And we had the COBRA meeting being delayed and whatnot as we were trying to figure out, are we going to do household quarantine? And then to add to it sounds so surreal it couldn't possibly be true, that day the Times had run a huge story about the Prime Minister and his girlfriend and their dog. And the Prime Minister's girlfriend was going completely crackers about this story and demanding that the press office deal with that. So we had this sort of completely insane situation in which part of the building was saying, are we going to bomb Iraq? Part of the building was arguing about whether or not we're going to do quarantine or not do quarantine. The Prime Minister has his girlfriend going crackers about something completely trivial. And you have all of these meetings kind of going on through the course of the 12th. In the end, we had the meeting on COBRA. We had the meeting on COVID, and we decided to push ahead with household quarantine pretty quickly. Fortunately, thank God, the Attorney General persuaded the Prime Minister not to go along with the whole bombing campaign. And then at the end of all of this, at roughly 9 o'clock that night, I then sat down with Ben Warner and with Mark Warner. And at that point, that's essentially when they kind of hit the total panic button with me. And they said, we're looking at all of this data, we're looking at all of these graphs. We're heading for total and utter catastrophe. We need to have plan B. And so Ben then went off and spoke to Patrick Vallance about this on Friday the 13th. On Friday the 13th, we then started to look through all of this information. We started to pick apart all of these different graphs. Ben spoke to Patrick. Patrick said, I'm also extremely concerned. It seems that something has gone fundamentally wrong in the wiring of the system. We've got these graphs showing that even on the best case scenario with the official plan, you're going to completely smash through the capacity of the NHS, not by a little bit, but by multiple times. The evening of Friday the 13th, I'm sitting with Ben Warner and the Prime Minister's private secretary in the Prime Minister's study. And we basically say we're going to have to sit down with the Prime Minister tomorrow and explain to him that we think that we're going to have to ditch the whole official plan and we're heading for the biggest disaster this country's seen since 1940. This is the whiteboard. I put it on my Twitter account, and I've also sent it to some journalists. Hopefully it'll be on, you can be able to see it on the internet, and you've got copies of it here. This has essentially Plan B sketched on it. The timestamp is 9 minutes past 8 on the Friday night. So essentially what's happening at this point is, we're thinking, what do we do on this? At this point, the second most powerful official in the country, Helen McNamara, is the Deputy Cabinet Secretary. She walked into the office while we're looking at this whiteboard. She says, I've just been talking to the official, Mark Sweeney, who is in charge of coordinating with the Department for Health. He said, quote, I've been told for years that there is a whole plan for this. There is no plan. We're in huge trouble. I've come through here to the, Helen McNamara said, I've come through here to the Prime Minister's office to tell you all, quote, I think we are absolutely fucked. I think this country is heading for a disaster. I think we're going to kill thousands of people. As soon as I've been told this, I've come through to see you. It seems from the conversation that you're having that that's correct. And I said, I think you're right. I think it is a disaster. I'm going to speak to the Prime Minister about it tomorrow. We're trying to sketch out here what Plan B is.
But I just want to be clear, because on the 14th you had that meeting, things changed, but on the 16th we did not close pubs, restaurants or ban mass sports events for another week. And I just want to understand, was your advice that we should go ahead and do all those things from the Monday when that advice was rejected, or did you not advise that?
So if you... this is the other whiteboard.
Could you just answer that question? Because I think that's very important we know. Did you advise that those things should happen?
So, yes and no. On the Saturday, we had the official meeting in the morning in the cabinet room. After the official meeting ended, I then got the Prime Minister into his study with me and Ben Warner and Mark Warner and the Prime Minister's private secretary for health. And we showed him...
Sorry, could we just get to the question? I just really want to understand, did you or did you not advise that pubs, restaurants should be shut? Yes or no?
As I say, yes, but it's more complicated than that. So we showed him this graph, and it has here, no mitigation, our plan. Yeah. This is all the NHS broken. Here's an actual plan, which is lockdown.
I'm really sorry, but I just want to be clear. So you did advise him, and he rejected that advice, and the pubs and restaurants and mass sports events carried on for another week. Is that correct?
So it's more complicated, as I said. We said on the 14th, we are going to have to lock down. We are going to have to get there as soon as we possibly can. All of you are being shown... So we'll come back to the kind of logic. The basic answer to your question is, yes, on the 14th we said to the Prime Minister, you are going to have to lock down. But there is no lockdown plan. It doesn't exist. SAGE haven't modelled it. DH don't have a plan. We are going to have to figure out and hack together a lockdown plan.
So it wasn't so much that you rejected your advice, it was just that we weren't physically ready to proceed on that basis, and we needed longer to work up how you would do things like that. Is that the broad picture?
Sort of. Essentially, the Prime Minister, quite reasonably, this was like, imagine, this is like a scene from Independence Day with Jeff Goldblum saying the aliens are here and your whole plan is broken and you need a new plan, right? That is what the scene was like that morning with Ben Warner in the Jeff Goldblum role. He took the Prime Minister through all the graphs and through the NHS graphs and showed him the system is thinking that this is all weeks and weeks and weeks away. You're being shown all of these graphs about time to peak of the epidemic in June, but this is all completely wrong. The NHS is going to be smashed in weeks,
and
we've got days.
Thank you. I just want to ask a final question because lots of colleagues want to come in, and it's about your role. So you're correct, your title was Assistant to the Prime Minister. But you were really the most powerful person in Downing Street after the Prime Minister, because everyone knew that he listened to you more than he listened to any civil servant, more than he listened actually to any cabinet minister. But you didn't advise him, in your own words, to change tack until the night of the 11th of March, and you didn't have a meeting to discuss that until the 14th of March, 6 weeks after our first case, 6 weeks after the World Health Organization had raised the alarm. You didn't advise him to cancel the Cheltenham Gold Cup, the Champions League matches, to lock down the borders, the things that could have prevented a lockdown. Now, he would have thought, I've not just got the scientific establishment who are telling me I don't need to lock down. I've actually got Dom, who's really interested in science and even goes along to the SAGE meetings as well. So do you not recognise that that was a massive failure on your part as his chief advisor, that you took so long to come to him with advice to change tack?
I think that there's no doubt, in retrospect, that yes, it was a huge failing of mine, and I bitterly regret that I didn't kind of hit the emergency panic button earlier than I did. I think, in retrospect, there's no doubt that I was wrong not to. All I can say is that my worry was, like, my mental sort of state at the time was, on the one hand, you could sort of know from the last week of February that a whole bunch of things are wrong. It was clear in all the meetings with the PHE, everybody, that everything was going wrong. Everything we pushed, everything we probed, everything was wrong, bad, terrible. But I was incredibly frightened, I guess is the word, about the consequences of me kind of pulling a massive emergency string and saying the official plan is wrong and it's going to kill everyone and you've got to change path. Because what if I'm wrong? What if I persuade him that to change tack, and that's a disaster? Everyone's telling me that if we go down this alternative path, it's going to be 5 times worse in the winter. And what if that's the consequence? So I think in retrospect, it's clear that the official plan was wrong. It's clear that the whole advice was wrong. And I think it's clear that we obviously should have locked down essentially the first week of March at the latest. We certainly should have been doing all of these things weeks earlier than we did. I think it's unarguable that that is the case. I personally bitterly regret that it wasn't until around about the 11th or the 12th that I started to do that. But to be clear, on the 12th, okay, on this crazy day of the 12th, we're sitting in the Prime Minister's office. The Cabinet, we're talking about the herd immunity plan. The Cabinet Secretary said, Prime Minister, you should go on TV tomorrow and explain to people the herd immunity plan and that it's like the old chickenpox parties. We need people to get this disease because that's how we get herd immunity by September. And I said, Mark, you've got to stop using this chickenpox analogy. It's not right. And he said, why? And Ben Warner said, because chickenpox is not spreading exponentially and killing hundreds of thousands of people. And you could sense in the whole room there was this kind of shock. And it was only really at that moment that we realised, and Mark, now, to stress, this wasn't some weird thing that the Cabinet Secretary had come up with. He was saying what the official advice to him from the Department of Health was. So it was a huge big deal for me and for Ben Warner to say, basically, we think that this whole thing is wrong. Now, should we have done it earlier? In retrospect, I think obviously we should, and I'm terribly, deeply sorry that I didn't. But hopefully people can realise why I was also very fearful of doing that, because it did cause absolute carnage. Once we did this on the 14th, and once we then started to push the Prime Minister to change path, lots of people did come to me and say, what on earth are you doing? We're going to lock down, it's going to bounce back up, it's going to be worse, this is all going to be, on you and the people who are trying to change path. Now, I think, I've said it, I think I'm terribly sorry that I didn't do it earlier, but it just seemed like such a massive thing. It was almost surreal, the whole experience. And part of what me and Ben, on the Friday night we were doing this, and then the next morning when there was this kind of the Jeff Goldblum scene with Ben explaining things, the whole thing just seemed like a kind of out of control movie. And in retrospect, it's clear that we should have acted earlier, but at the time, we just didn't.
Okay, we've got quite a lot more ground to cover, as I think you'd expect. So I'm going to turn to my colleagues, starting with Mark Logan and then Rosie Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. And so, Mr. Cummings, in British politics, you're considered as extremely successful by many people. You took back control, you got Brexit done. But when it comes to this particular issue, why were you not able to nail an earlier lockdown?
didn't pay enough attention to it early enough, for sure. So one other thing that I should have done earlier on, one of the other reasons why I finally had the confidence to say that I thought that the system had gone catastrophically wrong was, I also got in touch with a guy called Professor Tim Gowers at Cambridge, who's a Fields medalist. He's one of the smartest people on the planet. And I got in touch with him, and I started sharing SAGE documents with him in the week of the 9th, I can't remember the exact date. And people like him, and then shortly afterwards, Demis Hassabis at DeepMind, who I also started sharing documents with and talking to, they actually could understand these things. And so the combination of Mark Warner, Hassabis, Tim Gowers, you had three incredibly able people who could understand the technicalities in a way that I couldn't do, saying this to me. And that gave me the kind of confidence to say to the Prime Minister, we should change. But it's obvious in retrospect that I just left this whole thing until far too late, and I'm terribly sorry about that. Like, I should have done this in January, is the reality of it. And I think that was a big part. We just had this close. It was a classic. You read about these things in history books. It was literally a classic historical example of groupthink in action. And because the process was closed, that's what happens in closed groupthink bubbles. Everyone just reinforced themselves, and the more people from the outside attacked, the more people internally said, "Oh, well, they don't understand, and they haven't got access to all this information and whatnot." So it was this classic groupthink bubble. Now, in the end, I think a lot of people will say I did the wrong thing by trying to bounce the system into a different path, and who knows? But whether that's right or wrong, what is unarguably the case is that part of my job was to say, in situations like this, to challenge things, and I did do it on other things. And although I did do it here, I obviously did not do it early enough, and that is the heart of the thing. If this process had been opened up to outside scientific scrutiny and other smart people's scrutiny, because remember, a lot of people who figured out the answer to this were quantitative people, but who were not epidemiologists and disease specialists. There were people like Hassabis, there were people like Gowers, there were people like Mark Warner. If we'd opened the process up to them in January and put all of these assumptions out on the table, we'd have figured out at least six weeks earlier that there was an alternative plan. And this whole thing of, well, you've only got a choice between that peak or delay and then that peak is complete garbage. In fact, the plan that we put to the PM on the 14th, we could have developed that 6 weeks earlier about suppress and then build and crash programs for drugs and vaccines and everything else. So, I failed and I apologise for that.
On your earlier point about inertia, I mean, why do you think that was? And I use a personal example. Mid to end of January last year, my wife and child were sat about 500 miles east of Wuhan, waiting to return to the UK, and they were saying to me, "This is very real." We had a meeting in Parliament. It was Chris Whitty chaired it on the 11th of February. 650 MPs were invited. I think about 15 or at the most 20 attended. There was just a sense of inertia, and to your earlier point, a lack of urgency. What explains that? Is it people? Is it the institutions? Is it cultural?
Well, we obviously had the wrong people in all sorts of crucial things. I also think it's important to realise that at this time, not just the Prime Minister, but many other people thought that the real danger is not the health danger, but the overreaction to it and the economy. Now, the Prime Minister said all the way through February and through the first half of March, the real danger here isn't this new swine flu thing, it's that the reaction to it is going to cripple the economy. And to be fair to the Prime Minister, although I think he was completely wrong, lots of other senior people in Whitehall had the same view, that the real danger was the economic one. And it was because of this groupthink that people, and also the fact that all of these health graphs about the lack of urgency, I think this is an incredibly important point, which I should have explained before. All of these graphs had time to peak with 12 weeks away, right? So when we're talking about meetings in the week of the 9th, when people like the Warners were saying, panic, panic, advance, everyone was thinking, we've got ages to think about this. The peak is not until June. We've got weeks to potentially make decisions about these things. There was a fundamental misunderstanding about how far this already was in the country, how fast it was spreading in the country. The lack of testing data was an absolutely critical disaster because we didn't realise early enough how far it had already spread. So all these graphs are like this, showing peak in June, whereas the real graph was like that, and we were already much further up it. And we didn't realise that, though, until after we'd even looked down. Even a week after we looked down on the 23rd of March, official graphs were still showing this thing going up and peaking in June, even though we already knew from the numbers inside the ICUs and deaths that the official graphs had to be completely wrong. Do you see what I mean? So this, like, part of the lack of urgency was this, the testing data was wrong, the graphs that we were shown on the models were all wrong because they were all pushed out to the right. And that massively contributed to the whole lack of urgency. Further, another critical thing was this, the reasonable worst case scenario planning system. Now, there's a guy called Phil Tetlock wrote a book, and in that book he said you should not use words like reasonable and probable and likely because it confuses everybody. And this was a classic example of how this happened, because the reasonable worst case scenario was originally seen at the end of February was basically, well, this is the worst thing that could possibly happen, but of course it's not going to happen. In the first week of March, I was told, well, there's a 20% chance that it could happen. On the 2nd, I think, of March, I was told, officially, there's a 20% chance that the reasonable worst case scenario could happen, right? That's the 2nd of March. By the time we get to the 13th of March and I'm waving around Plan B, scientists are starting to come to number 10 saying, hang on a second, the reasonable worst case scenario is now our central planning assumption. Right? That's terrible, because the whole thing has suddenly crept up on us from literally 10 days earlier, probably not, definitely, very, very unlikely, to first week of March, well, 20% chance, to literally a week later, this is now our central planning assumption. And on top of that, as I said, the graphs being all out to the right meant that the truth was even more bad than the reasonable worst case scenario. Do you see what I mean?
And just very briefly, and last question is, during January and February and March time, how was the international experiences of the likes of China and Taiwan, how was that being fed into the system, and did we take serious note of? It was essentially
completely discarded by the system, and I think that was another one of the tragic errors. And it goes back to what I think it was Jeremy mentioned earlier on about some of the kind of behavioural assumptions. Fundamentally, in January, February, March, even after we got through to lockdown on the 23rd, and in the immediate few days after that, basically almost the universal view was that it's just inconceivable that we're going to be able to do a Taiwan type thing. I've got text messages from myself saying, if Taiwan is doing this and if Singapore is doing this, and we're not going to do it, in Singapore everything is in English, everyone can read what they're doing. Right? It's not like it's in Chinese. Everyone's going to be able to see a highly competent country operating in English, a completely different approach. If we're not going to do that, we're going to have to have a really good explanation. But the basic default mode was, this country's not East Asian, the people won't wear it, and it's just it's impossible. And it was only after we started to push through this idea of Plan B. This is why, for example, testing stopped. Right? Remember, testing basically stopped, and the government officially said, oh, well, there's no point testing everyone anymore. Now, what obviously should have been happening is that in January we've been ramping up testing massively. In January we should have been saying...
Come on to testing in the next session, suppose.
But hopefully that explains. Fundamentally, this groupthink, the groupthink about there's no option apart from one peak or the second peak, was completely tied together with the East Asian approach is simply completely politically, technically, in every sense, not viable in this country. And that didn't change until after the kind of weekend of the 14th, 15th, as we tried to kind of push through Plan B.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll go to Rosie Cooper, then Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Cummings. The Chair has asked you about the long delays in publishing SAGE papers, and you described even more worryingly COBRA meetings leaking. So why not gain the public trust and publish the papers? Were there political barriers to having those papers published?
There were, so as I said, when I talked to Patrick Vance about this, Patrick actually was completely supportive of it, as you would expect from a good scientist. He said, I think that's correct, we should publish all of these things, we should publish the code for the models. So there was no pushback from Patrick at all, or from Chris Whitty. As far as I'm aware, there was no pushback from SAGE either. I think the problem was that by the time we kind of had this conversation, we were sort of into a crisis, if you see what I mean. What should have happened is we had that conversation in January and then published everything then, and that would have saved our bacon. We didn't really have the conversation about publishing things until the week of the 9th, when we were already, sort of dangling over the cliff.
Rosie?
Well, okay. I think the public will be very, very disturbed to hear the picture you paint, which is a chaotic picture, almost a pick and mix attitude to scientific evidence, talk of sending the virus packing in 12 weeks, chickenpox parties, and there's an alleged comment from the Prime Minister of bodies piling up in the street. You might want to comment on that. But all the while, in its coordinating role, the Department of Health led specifically on PPE procurement and the design and setup of test and trace. So they did that on a largely outsourced business model, no penalty clauses for bad performance. And all we're really hearing here is incompetence, chaos. So how would you rate the performance of the Department of Health, the Secretary of State? Outstanding, good, requires improvement, or inadequate, and why?
I think that there was some brilliant, like in much of the government system, there was many brilliant people at relatively junior and middle levels who were terribly let down by senior leadership. I think that the Secretary of State for Health should have been fired for at least 15, 20 things, including lying to everybody in multiple occasions, in meeting after meeting in the cabinet room and publicly.
Rosie?
Oh dear. In that case, do you think people should be worried about facing corporate manslaughter charges?
I don't know about that, because I don't really know what the kind of laws are and the rules are, but I think that there is no doubt that many senior people were just terrible. As I said in my opening statement, I think there's no doubt at all that many senior people performed far, far disastrously below the standards which the country has a right to expect. I think that the Secretary of State for Health is certainly one of those people. I said repeatedly to the Prime Minister that he should be fired. So did the Cabinet Secretary. So did many other senior people.
Thank you. In the evidence we've heard so far, and I do understand that we're going to come on to test and trace later, but I wonder if you could comment on why the financial incentives for people with COVID-19 to self-isolate were so fundamentally weak. They were fatally weak, and that is a big problem for the spread of this disease.
I think that's right. I think that the Chancellor did an absolutely outstanding job on furlough. But I would point out that him and his team, he had some brilliant people, a guy called Mike Webb, Tim Loynig, Liam Booth-Smith. That team had to basically create the whole furlough scheme completely out of thin air in just a few days. There wasn't any plan for furlough at all. Nothing, zero, nada. They had to completely pull that out of nothing. And the problem that you're describing about the financial incentives on COVID and isolation is, you are obviously completely correct. There should have been a whole plan, but like on testing, like on shielding, there was no plan. When we got to that point and said, right, what are we going to do on financial incentives? There wasn't any plan. Now, if you go back to the 3rd, the government published a document on the 3rd, which was the contain, mitigate, delay thing. When we got that document, right, we'd been told for weeks, we've got all of these plans in place, etc., etc., etc. When we got this document, we leafed through it, and Ben Warner literally said, this is the press release, where's the actual plan? This is the plan. No, this is the press release. Where's the actual plan? Where's the document like that has all the stuff on, things like what you're talking about? Oh, well, we don't know. We haven't got that. We don't know where it is. So on all of these things, it turned out that we in Number 10 were operating on completely false assumptions. This is why I say how I blame myself terribly for not digging into all of this before I did. Like, we started to realise in the last week of February, in the first week of March, that this was the case. On shielding on the 19th, okay, at the 19th of March, I pulled all the officials in on shielding to say, where is the plan on shielding? Not only was there not a plan, lots of people in the Cabinet Office said, we shouldn't have a plan. We shouldn't put out a helpline for people to call because it'll all just be swamped and we haven't got a system. Now, thank God, a brilliant official in the Department for Health worked with a guy called Oliver Lewis, and they hacked together a team. But the shielding plan was literally hacked together in 2 all-nighters after the 19th, I think, of the Thursday the 19th. There wasn't any plan for shielding. There wasn't even a helpline for shielding. There wasn't any plan for financial incentives. There wasn't any plan for almost anything in any kind of detail at all.
Rosie?
Thank you. Final bit from me. The picture you describe is absolutely terrifying. You described the Department of Health as smoking ruins. What did you mean by that? And did you actually hear the Prime Minister say words to the effect, if the bodies pile up, so be it?
Why did I describe the Department of Health as a smoking ruin? Well, because, as I said, there were lots of great people in it, but the procurement system with which they were operating was just completely hopeless. It wasn't set up at all there wasn't any system set up to deal with proper emergency procurement. I'll give you an example of this. On the 20, I think it was the day that the Prime Minister tested positive, whatever that Friday was, the 27th, I think. In that meeting, we were told at the Cabinet table by officials that the Department of Health had been turning down ventilators because the price had been marked up. I mean, it's completely beggars belief that sort of thing was happening. When I was having PPE meetings around the Cabinet room table, we were told, oh, well, the PPE won't arrive, this obviously is not going to arrive for months. Well, why is it not going to arrive for months? Well, because it takes that long to ship. Why are you shipping it? Well, we ship it because that's what we always do. But hang on, we're going to have a peak in the NHS around about mid-April, and you're shipping things from China that are going to arrive in months' time, and all the airplanes are not flying. Leave this meeting, commandeer the planes, fly them to China, drop them at the nearest airfield, pick up our stuff, fly it back. At this point, we had Trump sending the CIA around trying to gazump everybody on PPE. But the whole system was just like wading through treacle on all of these sorts of things. There wasn't an emergency fast-track process for people to deal with these kind of things. That's why I describe it as smoking ruin. And that's why the Cabinet Secretary quite rightly said, we've got to basically divvy up the Secretary of State's job, because there's just multiple huge things here that are all being dropped. Testing, ventilators, PPE, vaccines, drugs, you name it. Because it was clear that the department was just completely and utterly overwhelmed.
Okay, thank you, Rosie. I'm going to go on to Rebecca Long-Bailey, but I just wanted to pick up something that you said, Mr. Cummings. I think I heard you correctly in accusing the Health Secretary of having lied. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes.
That's obviously a serious charge. Can you provide the committee with the evidence behind that assertion?
Yes, I mean, there are numerous examples. I mean, in the summer, he said that everyone who needed treatment, who got the treatment that they required. He knew that that was a lie because he'd been briefed by the chief scientific advisor and the chief medical officer himself about the first peak. And we were told explicitly people did not get the treatment that they deserved. Many people were left to die in horrific circumstances.
Is that the basis of your assertion? Are there other pieces?
Of what, sorry?
Is that the basis of your assertion, or are there other pieces of evidence that you base that charge on?
Yes, I mean in mid-April, just before the Prime Minister and I were diagnosed with having COVID ourselves, the Secretary of State for Health told us in the Cabinet room, everything is fine on PPE. We've got it all covered, etc., etc. When I came back, almost the first meeting I had in the Cabinet room was about the disaster over PPE and how we were actually completely sure that hospitals all over the country were running out. Secretary of State said in that meeting, this is the fault of Simon Stevens, it's the fault of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, it's not my fault, they've blocked approvals on all sorts of things. I said to the Cabinet Secretary, please investigate this and find out if it's true. The Cabinet Secretary came back to me and said, it's completely untrue. I have lost confidence in the Secretary of State's honesty in these meetings.
The Cabinet Secretary said that?
The Cabinet Secretary said that to me, and the Cabinet Secretary said that to the Prime Minister.
Did you make a note of that at the time?
Yes.
Could you supply that to the committee?
Yes.
And to corroborate the accusation that you've made against the Health Secretary, you've given orally some what is in your mind when you make that charge. I'd be grateful if you'd write to the committee to set it out so that we can consider it. Obviously, that's a very serious thing to say. I'm sorry I interrupted Rebecca Long-Bailey, who's about to ask her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings, for speaking to us today. Now, you've mentioned Whitehall dismissing the strict early measures taken in Taiwan and Wuhan, and you've also said that in Whitehall, the real danger was viewed as the economic one rather than the virus. Indeed, an article from the Institute of New Economic Thinking in November last year noted that the UK was one country of many that chose to limit pandemic response in favour of economic stimulus in the name of saving their economies at the expense of their citizens' lives. So who was providing economic advice to the government? What did it say? And who within government was arguing against taking strict measures for economic reasons, both at the start of the pandemic and throughout? And ultimately, did anyone within government actively attempt to trade off lives in favour of economic activity?
I slightly missed some of that, but I think I got the gist of it. There were quite a few people around Whitehall who thought that the real danger here was the economy. The Prime Minister's view throughout January, February, March was, as he said in many meetings, the real danger here is not the disease. The real danger here is the measures that we take to deal with the disease and the economic destruction that will cause. He had that view all the way through. In fact, one of the reasons why it was so rocky getting from the 14th, when we suggested Plan B to him, to actual lockdown, was because he kept basically bouncing back to, we don't really know how dangerous it is, we're going to completely destroy the economy by having lockdown, maybe we shouldn't do it. And through the course of that period, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, there was this constant sort of back and forth of, here's the hourly data coming in showing that we're further ahead in the pandemic than we realised, the situation is worse, the NHS situation is worse, everything is getting worse. And that kind of propelled things a bit towards lockdown. but it's also the case that fundamentally the Prime Minister just didn't really think that this was the big danger. Now, there have been lots of reports and accusations that the Chancellor was the person who was kind of trying to delay things in March. That is completely wrong. The Chancellor was totally supportive of me and of other people as we tried to make this transition from Plan A to Plan B. He got his team working on the furlough scheme, but it is the case that there were senior officials who worried that it's not completely unreasonable either to say, if you completely shut down the economy, you are definitely having huge, terrible effects on all sorts of people's lives. If you have a lockdown, you are definitely consigning some people to all kinds of suffering in various ways, and some of them might die because of the lockdown itself. So I think there were reasonable arguments. It's not like just having a lockdown was the obvious thing to do. There were reasonable arguments to say we've got to kind of weigh up all the other destructive effects of what to do. Now, me and others came to the conclusion that actually the logic was fundamentally false, because what we ended up arguing was, in fact, if you try not to lock down and you try and optimize for the short-term economy, you won't actually even get that, because what will happen is the public will lock themselves down because they'll realise that there isn't going to be any NHS for anybody. That was the reality, and I think this point is even now is constantly lost. In the scenario that we were heading for, not only would you have had hundreds of thousands of deaths from COVID, you would then have had absolutely no NHS at all for anybody. Your 7-year-old daughter falls over and needs A&E, there is no A&E for her. You got cancer treatment, there is no cancer treatment. Nothing at all for anybody for 3 months. That's what we were facing. And part of our argument was, once people realise that that's the situation that we're heading for, they will be so terrified they'll stay at home anyway. There's going to be some kind of lockdown, whatever happens. Either we get ahead of this and we try and do it as intelligently and sensibly as we possibly can, or if we plough into this process where we basically just say, well, there's no alternative and we're just going to have to get through it, you're going to have not only hundreds of thousands of people dead from COVID, not only then hundreds of thousands of people dead because there's no NHS for 3 months, you're then going to have a gigantic economic disaster on top of it all anyway. Do you see what I mean?
Let's take some more questions from Rebecca.
Well, sadly, I think not locking down hard enough or soon enough has arguably produced far more long-term adverse economic effects and needlessly cost so many lives. And that was a point made by the IMF some time ago. Did the government commission official economic advice to sit alongside the scientific advice it was receiving? And when you moved towards that groupthink on Plan B, as you suggested earlier, was there an economic advice produced alongside that to show the outcome of such decisions being taken?
I mean, I'm absolutely sure that there was all sorts of economic advice happening, going on and being written. I don't personally remember it because it wasn't my focus. I knew that Rishi and his team, the Chancellor and his team, were extremely competent, and therefore I basically left them to deal with the economic stuff like furlough because I had complete confidence that they'd be able to do it. I was focusing my time and efforts on all the other things like shielding in the Department for Health, where it was clear that the system was broken. So I'm afraid I'm not. Well, what I can definitely say is there's not some kind of document floating around that says here is the economic costs, and that everyone was looking at that, or the Prime Minister was looking at that and said, oh, well, we're looking at this document, maybe we shouldn't do this. That wasn't the case, and that didn't happen. It was the case that the Bank of England, the senior officials in the Treasury, senior officials in the Cabinet Office were saying, we have to think about the consequences of, if we do this lockdown, we're going to have to borrow huge amounts of money. What if the bond markets suddenly spike and go crazy and refuse to lend us? We're going to then have to find emergency powers to tell the Bank of England to buy the debt, etc., etc. So there were conversations going on at the time about that possible problem, and what if we have a kind of financial crisis and bond market crisis and sterling crisis, etc., on top of the whole health crisis. There were conversations about that, and there were meetings with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor and the Cabinet Secretary and me to discuss it. But to stress, all the stories saying that the Chancellor tried to stop this happening or tried to delay it, all of those stories are wrong. The Chancellor completely supported what me and Ben Warner and others were, and Patrick Vallance as well, were arguing for from the 14th about accelerating through to Plan B.
Okay, final question. Point 24 of your recent Twitter thread on the government's handling of the pandemic states that the public inquiry will at no point ask, how does the deep institutional wiring of the party's civil service programme destructive behaviour by putting the wrong people in wrong jobs with destructive incentives? So in your view, who was destructive? What were their incentives? And were those incentives financial?
Well, I think there's a very profound question about the nature of our political system that means that we got at the last election a choice between Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson. I think any system which ends up giving a choice between two people like that as the people to lead is obviously a system that's gone extremely badly wrong. There's so many thousands and thousands of wonderful people in this country who could provide better leadership than either of those two, and there's obviously something terribly wrong with the political parties if that's the best that they can do. It's also the case that I don't exclude myself from this. In any sensible, rational government, it is completely crazy that I should have been in such a senior position, in my personal opinion. I'm not smart. I've not built great things in the world. It's completely crackers that someone like me should have been in there, just the same as it's crackers that Boris Johnson was in there and that the choice at the last election was Jeremy Corbyn. It's also the case that there are wonderful people inside the civil service. There are brilliant officials all over the place. But the system tends to weed them out from senior management jobs. And the problem in this crisis was very much lions led by donkeys over and over again, with great people on the ground doing things. As I said, this brilliant young woman, Jen Allen, she wasn't the top person in GDS. There were great people further down the hierarchy who did brilliant things, but the leadership, people like me and the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Health, we let down the people on the front line, and we let down those excellent officials as well. And we all should be asking, you guys in the political parties need to ask yourselves, what is it about your parties that give choices like Johnson versus Corbyn? And we have to ask, what is it about Whitehall that promotes so many senior people who are completely out of their depth?
Thank you.
The question was specifically about the very specific comment that you made. You inferred that there were people with destructive incentives involved at a government level throughout the pandemic. Who were those people and what were those destructive incentives? It's a very, very specific statement to make, and the answer that you've given is very general and outside of the sphere of government, unfortunately.
So I think, you're asking about destructive incentives. What I meant by that, I think you're implying, do I think that corruption was a big part of the problem? And that's not at all what I meant by destructive incentives. What I meant is that politicians are incentivized to play to the media tomorrow in the headlines, that officials are incentivized to keep their heads down and to follow processes, even when things like that are going to kill thousands of people. The incentives are not programmed to say, how do we get people who understand how to make decisions under uncertainty into key jobs? They are not, how do we get people with brilliant operational capability into key jobs? The incentives are constantly pushing people away from rational behaviour and building what's needed at scale quickly. That's what I meant by destructive incentives.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Just before I turn to Laura Trott, Mr. Cummings, you say that you're not smart enough to keep pace with discussions in SAGE and all the rest of things. But you do, I'm sure, have an appreciation of good order in government. And you told us earlier that Cobra was not a place in which you could have candid conversations because it leaked. In other words, there were unauthorised briefings. Did you ever engage in unauthorised briefings?
What do you mean by unauthorised briefings?
Briefings that weren't authorised by the Prime Minister and those others in senior positions in government.
So in general, sort of my engagement with the media was very different before the election and after the election. Before the election, I had quite a lot of engagement with the media. Once the election was called in October 2019, after that, I had actually extremely little dealings with the media. One of the issues that happened is that in January, I essentially stopped talking to almost all journalists almost all the time. And in fact, during the course of 2020, one of the things that you read constantly is this basically drove the media mad because nobody in my position had essentially stopped talking to the media for decades. I was working, say, roughly 100-hour weeks. Of that time, less than an hour a week for sure, less than 1%, much less than 1% was spent talking to the media. I did occasionally talk to people. The main person, really, though, that I spoke to in the whole of 2020 was Laura Koonsberg at the BBC, because the BBC has a special position in the country, obviously during a crisis. And because I was in the room for certain crucial things, I could give guidance to her on certain very big stories. For example, I'll give you an example of the sort of thing I did. On the 18th, the Wednesday, the 18th of March, huge rumours spread that there was going to be a London-only lockdown, and pictures started appearing in some of the media and websites about tanks encircling the M25 and cutting it off and whatnot. Laura Koonsberg called me and said, this story is happening. Is it true? I said, I can categorically tell you it's definitely not true. You should definitely not report it. I absolutely 100% guarantee it. And that meant that the BBC did not, like some of the media did, run the story. So but that was really very occasional. I spoke to her maybe on average once every 3 or 4 weeks through the course of the year.
Okay.
But I actually spoke to the media close to zero in the course of 2020.
Well,
I did, though, your question about unauthorised, yes, I did talk to people unauthorised in the sense of, actually pretty rarely did I speak to the Prime Minister before I spoke to any journalists. I just got along with things because my view was the Prime Minister already is about 1,000 times far too obsessed with the media and in a way which undermined him doing his own job. So the last thing I wanted to do was to involve him in further conversations about the media. And in fact, I did everything I could to limit the conversations the Prime Minister had regarding the media. So unauthorised in that sense, yes.
In an hour a week, you can convey quite a lot of information, whether it's to Laura Koonsberg or anyone else. You've said that Cobra became dysfunctional because you couldn't rely on its confidentiality. You've also said in the context of SAGE that there was too much secrecy, that the things should be much more in the public domain so that people can interrogate it.
Yeah.
In that spirit, will you publish the texts and emails that you sent to members of the media during the period from January to the summer?
So I think there's two different things. The SAGE stuff should be published. Scientific advice should be published unless there are very, very specific national security reasons for it. You can imagine some crises where it will be different than COVID.
But not your briefings.
What, sorry?
But not your briefings.
So I'll come on to that. The Cobra process, I think, is different. The problem there is that the government should be much more transparent. But the answer for that is not ministers, SPADs, officials just leaving the room, picking up the phone and randomly calling whoever they feel like, often to get a favour from someone. That's not proper transparency. It's not good government. What that does is sow absolute chaos through the whole system. What is the case, though, on Cobra is, and I think that the whole workings of the process around Cobra should have been much more open, but done in a kind of orderly way, where it's like, right, here we are on the record, here is the logic, here is the workings of how we got to it. And I think if people would have been able to see more of the kind of back and forth and the logic, both in Sage and in Cobra, then it would have enormously helped, because outside experts would have been able to see and go, well, that's not right, or we can contribute to this. But that culture just doesn't exist. In terms of me,
but doesn't that apply completely to your briefings of the media to make sure that they are accurate and authoritative? It would be helpful for them to be in the public domain, just in the way that you described the communications from Cobra and the proceedings in Sage.
Well, obviously, the things that on the rare occasions when I spoke to the media myself and tried to explain things, I'm trying to explain what's happening with official government policy. They are
for good, high-minded reasons.
Official
I'm sure.
Official briefings. So it's not in any sense normal for everybody just to publish every conversation that they have with the media. I think.
But if that was their intended purpose,
it's hard to see how that would work.
Well, if that's their intended purpose, it's to give an accurate and fair reflection, to correct misapprehensions, and possibly, as you say, you cited a story that would be wrong. What is the problem with publishing that so that people can see it?
Well, I'd be happy to talk to you about it further. I think there's huge lessons around the whole.
Well, we're talking now. Can you make a commitment? You've committed to publish other messages, for example, with the Prime Minister, with the Health Secretary, and others. Given that these were, as you say, briefings designed to be clear and helpful, in that same spirit, will you share them with the committee?
Well, almost all of these things are conversations. First of all, so there's nothing. So
almost all, but some are texts and messages.
First of all, there's nothing to share. Secondly, having a system in which all written communication between everybody in government and all journalists is all published is a very, very serious change to how the media operates in this country. I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which you could improve the system. There's all sorts of ways in which you could have greater transparency. I'm not sure that it's possible in a free society to say that we're going to have everybody in government. I mean, would you, for example, say that you would publish all of your WhatsApp messages with all journalists over the last 12 months?
I haven't made the commitment that you have today to transparency, to the point that you published an image, a picture of a whiteboard in Downing Street. Mm-hmm. Presumably, that was in a private circumstance. You did it, I'm sure, to be able to put into the public domain helpful information.
Yeah.
So will you share with the committee, clearly on the basis that the briefings that you gave, such texts as you've retained, would be helpful, will you share them?
Well, first of all, I think there's almost nothing that I've got like that, which is actually
might be very little, which makes it easier.
Contribute very much. Secondly, what I certainly would do is look back at my text with various journalists and see, are there things amongst these that I think have a kind of what I would say is this: anything which I think has a kind of direct bearing on the decisions that were made and the mistakes that were made, I would be happy to share those.
Well, can we be the judge of that, so that we can understand what you were briefing to?
With great respect, Chairman, I'm not going to say to you that I'm going to hand over my private phone and let you just scroll through everything and decide what it is you think I deserves or does not deserve to be in the public domain. I will certainly look through what I've said to various journalists, and as I said, anything which I think is significant to how decisions were made, in particular mistakes that were made, including by me, then I will share those. But once you get into that sort of thing, you're into difficult territory, because you're also sharing things which journalists themselves are assuming are going to be private. So it requires a lot of careful thought before we go down such a path like that.
Everyone,
in principle, I'm in favour of maximum transparency on this whole process.
Everyone understands that, and there's no one in the committee, least of all me, that wants to have access to your mobile phone, and perhaps we can rely on your candour in selecting those messages.
I'll certainly have to look through things anyway in order for the public inquiry, right? So as I go through the process for the public inquiry,
we're keen to learn lessons on the way, and it would help if we had it now.
My point is I'm going to have to go through that process anyway for the public inquiry. So as I go through that process, if there are things I think are relevant to this committee, then I will speak to some of the people involved and see what might be done.
Laura Trott and then Catherine Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Dom. Did anyone mention a pandemic plan or a risk register to you before 2020?
Yes.
And what circumstance did they do that?
I had conversations with various people in the Cabinet Office between July 2019 and the general election in 2019 about the risk register in general. Also, some specific kind of national security risk register issues. And also in my time in government, I had various specific meetings with people about the question of bioterrorism, which is obviously overlaps with pandemic planning.
And did you have any view on the quality of the pandemic plan that you were shown at that point?
I thought that many of the plans seemed to me to be to fall very far short of what is actually needed. A lot of things are just kind of PowerPoints, and they lack detail. But most importantly, I think the process around them, as with the pandemic plan, is just not is not open. It hasn't. There is not a culture of talking to outside experts. I'll give you a recent example. I was talking to some people who said to me, "Did you ever go and read the plan on solar flares?" And I said no. And they said, "Well, if you get some expert advice on that, you'll see that the current government plan on that is just completely hopeless. If that happens, then we're all going to be in a worse situation than COVID." So I think one thing that I did say to the Cabinet Secretary last year in the summer, and which I ardently hope is actually happening, is there ought to be an absolutely thorough, total review of all such risk register programmes. There ought to be an assumption of making this whole process open. It should be open by default and only closed for specific things. For example, one of the other things very high on the risk register is the anthrax plan. What happens if terrorists attack with anthrax? Personally, I would be extremely concerned that that plan is as robust as it should be. I can't go into any details of it, but I think there's no doubt that everything like that needs the most incredible, careful thought. You know, this country spends tens of billions of pounds on national security issues, but we don't spend anything like the right amount of money or engage the right kind of people involved. Now, bear in mind that on this, as soon as people like Mark Warner and Demis Hassabis and Tim Gowers looked at what was being planned, they could say straight away, this is wrong, the logic's wrong here, the logic's wrong there. I'm absolutely sure that if you opened up this kind of process, not to people like me, who don't, frankly, wouldn't have good questions to ask, but there's definitely a way in which that process could be improved.
And did you make those comments at the time in 2019? You said you made those comments to the Cabinet Secretary in the summer of 2020, if I understand you.
Yes.
Did you make those comments in 2019?
Yes. In 2019, we kicked off a whole process around the what became known as the integrated review. But there were all sorts of conversations in the second half of 2019, which I was involved in, about rethinking the whole way in which we look at national security questions like this.
And was anything done on the pandemic plan specifically as a result of the questions that you raised in 2019, do you know?
I don't know, and I can't remember now. I asked number 10 before I came today if I could go and review my official diary and my official emails from that whole time, so that I could try and help this committee as much as I possibly could do. But they declined to let me do that. So I'm afraid I don't have all the records for that.
And who, to your knowledge, is responsible for monitoring future threats?
Very much depends what kind of threats you mean.
So if we're thinking about a pandemic, let's just take that. So who is responsible within government for monitoring those future threats, to your understanding? Is it the Civil Contingency Secretariat?
Well, I think a fundamental problem with this whole business, and a fundamental problem that was exposed in COVID, is this kind of multiple responsibilities. No one has an answer to your question. That's part of the problem. In one sense, you could say the Cabinet Secretary is responsible because he's responsible for the whole civil service, but that's only really nominal. He would say, quite reasonably, I'm not a pandemic expert, I'm not a blah blah expert, you have to speak to so-and-so, and the Chief Scientific Advisor signs off this, and so-and-so signs off that. One of the fundamental problems with that you find in this whole thing, it's a general problem in Whitehall, but it was very, very clear and disastrous during COVID, is you have this system where, on the one hand, ministers are nominally responsible in various ways for ABC, but ministers cannot actually hire and fire anybody in the department. The officials are actually in charge of hiring and firing ABC. So as soon as you have some kind of major problem, you have, that Spider-Man meme with Spider-Man, both the Spider-Mans pointing at each other, but it's like that, but with everybody. So you have Hancock pointing at the Permanent Secretary, and you have the Permanent Secretary pointing at Hancock, and they're both pointing at the Cabinet Office. The Cabinet Office is pointing back at them, and all the different Spider-Mans are all pointing at each other, saying you're responsible. And the problem is, everyone's right and everyone's unhappy. Everyone kind of has a point about it, but it's not clear. And this was critical. In a well-run entity, what would have happened here is, essentially, in my opinion, you'd have had a kind of dictator in charge of this. If I had been Prime Minister, the way I would have handled this is, I would have said, Mark Warner is in charge of this whole thing. He speaks with my authority. He has as close to kingly authority as the state has legally to do stuff, and he's pushing the barriers of legality. He is in charge of everyone, and he can fire anybody, and he can move anybody, and he can jiggle the whole thing around. That way you actually have clear responsibility. One of the terrible problems that we had through April, May, June, as we were trying to build Plan B, was we in number 10 could say, right, we've got to build testing, we've got to do this, we've got to do the other. The Cabinet Secretary quite rightly was saying Hancock is responsible, but everybody else is saying Hancock's completely incapable of doing the job, so he can't be responsible.
I guess my questions are more around...
So no one gets to grips with who was actually in charge.
But I guess my questions are more around the kind of the monitoring of the risk, right? Who is raising that alarm, and who is the person that's responsible for kind of trying to make sure that we have a plan ready for the pandemic? So who were you having the conversations with in 2019 about the risk register?
It's a diffuse set of people. It's not clear. And again, this is the problem. So in one sense, it's a civil contingencies Secretariat inside the Cabinet Office has a sort of coordinating role. But I'll give you a classic example of that. On Monday the 16th of March, we asked, what is the view of the Cabinet Office Civil Contingency Secretariat on the various pandemic plans that have been given? Because as far as we can tell from our meetings, as far as I can tell from our meetings, some of them don't exist, and the ones that do exist have got gaping holes in. To which we were given the answer, these plans are not held centrally by the Cabinet Office. And so we're all clutching our head. This is the 16th of March. And we're suddenly told, we're all assuming that the Cabinet Office has had scrutiny of these things for like 6 to 8 weeks. We only find out on the 16th of March. Not only have they not been scrutinising and testing them and red teaming them, they haven't even seen them. And they're only beginning in the week of the 16th to actually interrogate to actually just get hold of these things.
And you'd assume that's the core competency of the Civil Contingency
Hello everyone, Steve Smith here, hope you're all doing well. So yeah, this Dominic Cummings sitting's running on quite for
We didn't have the data architecture
period of time, I guess. Sorry if I'm coming across
all
loud
of
there. My
that
headphones are not on
basically
properly.
imploded and had to be
Yeah, Prime Minister's
reconstructed
questions is on in just about half an hour
when you said on
now.
the 12th
so
of March that
with
the,
any luck,
paraphrasing,
this meeting
the
is
Cabinet
finished
Office
by
is
then. If
terrifyingly
not,
awful.
we will
Was
run
that what you
over
were
and then we
referring
will
to? The failure
start
in that
Prime
respect,
Minister's
just not
questions.
having any contingency planning
I
and not
will
holding that kind of purpose centrally.
Yeah, that was a big part of it. Again, I stressed there were lots of great officials in there, but this is part of the problem. Systems can make people smarter in various ways, and they can also make people dumber. And the problem in the Cabinet Office was, you like all over Whitehall, you had some great people, but it was clear that the wiring was wrong. The wiring of responsibilities was wrong. The wiring of incentives was wrong.
And in terms of, so you've spoken about the fact that you think a central person should have been responsible for the pandemic response once it was actually going. But in terms of the preparedness and monitoring of future threats, is it just that the Civil Contingencies Secretariat, in your view, should do their job better, or should there be a different organisation which performs that function?
I mean, essentially, I think that the whole wiring of how the Cabinet Office does national security issues in general needs to be radically changed. I mean, I started to work with the Cabinet Secretary on this process from summer last year, and that kind of, the sort of overlapping Venn diagram that touches on the civil contingencies, but it also touches on lots of other things. Essentially, and it also goes back to the kind of the way in which the COBRA system couldn't work. The COBRA system, as some people will know, is what's called a strap environment. And that means that it's an environment where you don't have phones, you can't just take in laptops. It's kept in a certain way, so the intelligence services know that Russia, China, North Korea, or whoever can't smuggle things in. That kind of system is completely hopeless for a pandemic, because it meant, and this is why we all moved out of COBRA. And we had to end up doing it in the cabinet, literally in the cabinet room, and just kind of gerrymander iPads and TV screens and stuff in there, because you couldn't get the people with the laptops and the internet connections and the data that we needed to look at into the cabinet room, into the COBRA room, because the COBRA room is a strap 3 and above environment, which doesn't allow such things in. So the whole wiring of how the Cabinet Office is set up to deal with this kind of crisis just fundamentally couldn't work. The COBRA, the last COBRA meeting I can even remember downstairs in the COBRA room, it was essentially a Potemkin meeting, because it was with the DAs, and what happened was, as soon as we had these meetings, Nicola Sturgeon would just go straight out and announce what she wanted straight afterwards. So again, you had these completely Potemkin meetings without anyone actually digging into the reality and the detail, because everybody thought as soon as the meeting's finished, everybody's going to just pop up on TV and start babbling. So that whole structure inside the Cabinet Office needs to be completely changed. And the good news is the Cabinet Secretary knows that. The Cabinet Secretary himself saw, as did a lot of other people last year, how the whole thing fell apart, and there is a plan to build a whole new system for dealing with this kind of thing. Or certainly there was a plan, and I was working on it with some great officials before I left. So I hope that that's all still being done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Laura. We'll go to Catherine Fletcher, who is very obviously a Lancashire MP. Catherine.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, we're scientists. This is a hearing of the Science and Tech Committee along with health colleagues from health. Science is driven by actualities and not speculation. And I just perhaps want to return to the data and the raw numbers that you had to inform your decision making in the period, say, between January and April, May last year. What's your assessment of the data? Because we've heard concerns from others.
I mean, concerns is it's like saying we've got concerns about the situation in May 1940. I mean, the whole thing was just complete.
Let's go on. Let's stay on the data.
In all sorts of ways, it didn't exist. So the data system on Monday, the 16th of March, was the following. It was me wheeling in that whiteboard that you've seen from the photo, and writing on, Simon Stevens reading out from scraps of paper numbers from the ICUs, and I would write them down on the left-hand side. And I would get my iPhone out and I would go times 2, times 2, times 2. And then I would write another column and I would say, so if it's doubling every 5 days, these are the numbers that we're going to be looking at. And everyone will look at the whiteboard and go, Jesus, could that possibly be correct? There was no functioning data system. And that was connected with, there was no proper testing data. Because we didn't have testing, all we could really do was look at people arriving in hospital. So the whole thing, therefore, is weeks and weeks out of date. Well, once you're looking at ICU numbers as your leading indicator, you know that you're in a world of trouble. Now, fortunately, one of the things that actually worked incredibly well was there's a brilliant official at the NHS called Nin, and she worked with a great British tech startup, and they essentially built in about 4 or 6 weeks a whole new NHS dashboard system. So the situation
between
that was roughly between they started working on it, I think, in the first week of March. In the week around about the 16th of March, the 24th of March, it was still me scribbling things on a whiteboard and hitting ×2 on my iPhone. But by the time I came back from being ill, which was the Tuesday the 13th of April, they basically then had an absolutely brilliant data system. So then you had all the NHS bed data, ventilator data, ICU data. They were then starting to build models and predictions of where the NHS was going. And that made a huge difference. It actually made a huge difference to the whole data agenda across government, because senior people actually got to see on a massive epic crisis how great data, how the difference between a completely non-existent data system and a world-class, really brilliant data system just completely transformed decision making over about a 4-week period.
Thanks. There's probably two things I want to pursue. Firstly, let's just nail this down. So there was a recognition that the data was poor, and work was commissioned in February to start in March to create an entirely new pandemic data dashboard to support what we were going to need to do to make decisions within the pandemic.
Correct. So actually what happened is
that's good. No, that's good. Given that really came to emerge, that's 6 to 8 weeks after the WHO declared the emergency. So that's a reasonably quick response, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's not bad. I mean, we got lucky in the sense that there was a brilliant company that was actually already working with Simon Stevens and the NHS on AI. They were trying to build a kind of AI lab for the NHS. It's a long-term project. Because they were working there already with the NHS data people and the NHS X team, they could basically, what happened is in the first week of March, they essentially spoke to this brilliant official Nin and Simon Stevens, and they basically said, right, drop all of the kind of long-term AI lab stuff. Let's just throw all of our resources into building this dashboard. So then they, from roughly speaking, the 3rd or the 5th or something like that, they were working on it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Okay, so this brings me to my second line of questioning. So I was fortunate enough to be starting to talk to colleagues about COVID back at the end of January, and attended the briefing from Professor Quiswitty that my colleague Mark Logue mentioned earlier, early February time. And what was apparent within that was the set ratios, the maths with which this disease travelled. So rough transmissibility rates, a range estimate of likely mortality rate across the whole population. And as a fellow studier of data, you will know that those things are relatively fixed. And whilst they become narrower in their range of certainties, you can make predictions from those things, which I know were available in February. So to what extent were you taking account of this expertise with your whiteboard in mid-March, when these ratios and disease proliferation and kind of disease death rates were known 6 weeks before?
So the problem was, so I think what you're saying is kind of half right. That you're right that a lot of the key numbers we kind of knew roughly, or at least we knew within some kind of confidence intervals. And you could make predictions about those. But where this went wrong was, we now know from various data that in fact COVID had spread faster and further in January and February than we realised at the time. So you're right that we knew a lot of these parameters and you could kind of draw graphs from them. But part of the whole point, at the meeting on the 14th in the Prime Minister's office, the kind of Independence Day Jeff Goldblum meeting, part of the whole point of that
Let's
was...
stick to data, shall we?
He was saying, these curves are all wrong. Yes, you can. The pattern, as you say, is clear, but they're all stretched out towards a peak in June. It's not going to peak in. That's not relevant.
So
the graph is actually going up like that.
New data emerged. And final question from me, Chair. I'm just really
It was very confused
how
at that.
The actual data tied in with the prediction data within the models. So to what extent you, leading the charge here, were able to put your calculations of the actual data into the scientific modelers to allow us to shift from predictions, which inevitably are sometimes right and sometimes wrong, into modelling the real world and making life or death decisions off the back of it. When did that happen?
That didn't really happen properly, I would say, until April. At the time when we were making these huge judgments about the 13th, 14th, around the kind of 13th, 14th, 15th of March, there were models, but as the graph that I showed you earlier on showed, when we got the updated graph...
It's all right, I won't be able to see it, and I don't think you shared it in advance.
In a nutshell, all of these graphs I've shown you, and the SAGE graphs at the time, have these terrifying curves like that, right? But they're peaking in June. What we realised, what Ben Warner said, and what Patrick Vallance and others said around about the 13th, 14th, was actually we think from patchy data that's coming in, including the ICU data, we're further along this curve. We're not back here at kind of week 2 with 10 weeks to go. We're up at week 6.
Understood.
So we're up there on the curve. Do you see what I mean? But officially,
scientists, new data emerged, and we reframed our hypotheses.
Yes, exactly. Right. We realised in the week of the 16th.
I'm dead conscious there's lots of other colleagues that want to come in. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And finally, in this section, Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Cummings, for coming. If I could return to the line of questioning Mr. Hunt pursued earlier about the planning and you gave us that quote from Helen McNamara on the 13th of March that there is no plan. But it's reported in late February 2020 that you said, well, I've seen the plan and I'm afraid it's not a plan at all. It's just a plan to have a plan at some stage. So, and in a fortnight or so between those, there were obviously hundreds of seeding events coming into the country. So, and that quote, by the way, was from your wife in The Spectator. So what were you doing in those 2 weeks, given that you already knew that there wasn't a meaningful plan in those first 2 weeks of March?
I was having meeting after meeting with people, trying to figure out where are we on the planning system. So that quote was referring to the document I mentioned earlier on, the contain, mitigate, delay thing. That was the document which was officially touted as a plan, but as you can see from it, it's not actually a plan at all. So what I was doing from round about the 25th, when people were hitting the panic button with me, was I was having meeting after meeting with people around Whitehall on issue after issue, shielding, this, that and the other, testing, etc., to try and figure out, okay, who has got a plan around here, who is actually doing what around here. And there were all sorts of people doing all sorts of great things, but it was also clear that overall there was not a coherent plan. And in particular, that reference on the night of the 13th from Helen McNamara and with Mark Sweeney was particularly about the NHS. It was about this mismatch of where is the NHS plan to deal with
lockdown,
the numbers. No. There isn't one because the NHS capacity is going to be maxed out by a factor of times 10. Like on the night of the 13th, one of the things that Mark Sweeney was talking about was there's not even a plan to bury all the bodies.
Yeah. So I mean, there was a period when we were saying we were 4 weeks behind Italy, and then very suddenly it became 2 weeks behind Italy when we realised where we were.
Yeah.
And that was because of the multitude of seeding events that we took place. We now know.
Yes.
I mean, we got data later about that. Was there any thought given to those seeding events during that early March period? Because obviously quarantine would have potentially delayed it and given us a little bit more time. Was there any thought given to that at all?
Essentially, no, and it's connected with what I said earlier on. The official view was it's inevitably going to spread. Mm-hmm. In retrospect, obviously, we should have had individual isolation in February. We should have had household isolation in February. We should have had, obviously, in retrospect, we should have had the Taiwan system, right? We should have closed the borders. We should have ramped up testing. We should have had masks compulsory. We should have had compulsory quarantine properly enforced. All of those things should have been happening in January.
So that was flawed scientific advice, and our committee heard from Patrick Vallance on the 25th of March last year that basically the government was entirely following scientific advice through this period, more or less. So, and we were ranked second for pandemic preparedness on international comparisons, which are obviously based on utterly flawed criteria. So this is all groupthink again.
Yes.
But so in your view, were all ministers, from the Prime Minister downwards, badly advised in that period before the first lockdown by the people who should have been looking out for them, the civil servants and scientific advisors?
I think all senior people involved with that process, me, the Cabinet Secretary, the CSA, CMO, I think all of us would say we got a lot of things wrong in that period. And I think, I have been critical of the Prime Minister, but there is, if you dropped, Bill Gates or someone like that into that job on the 1st of March, the most competent people in the world that you could possibly find, any of them would have had a complete nightmare. There is no doubt. There is no doubt that the Prime Minister made some very bad misjudgments and got some very serious things wrong. It's also the case that there is no doubt that he was extremely badly led down by the whole system, and it was a system failure, of which I include myself in that as well. I also failed.
Understood. I just wanted to close this session by asking about why you're here. Your previous attitude towards select committees of this House has been quite literally contempt. You've decided not to give evidence to select committees. Are you here today to help us learn lessons, or are you here to help settle scores for yourself?
I was invited here to come and to try and explain the truth about what happened. As I said, I think the families of all the thousands of people who died unnecessarily deserve the truth. That's why I'm here. I mean, the reason I can go into the reasons why I didn't attend meetings about the referendum if you'd like, but I'm not sure if anyone wants to go into that.
I don't want to do that now. I just was trying to get to the bottom of, you've obviously made some fairly major swipes at some fairly major political figures in the last few hours, and that sort of leads me to ask, what was your actual motivation in working for the Prime Minister? Was it to get your ideas into government? Was that your motivation, and is the fact that COVID derailed that, is that a source of regret to you?
I went in because in summer 2019, it seemed to me that the choice that the country faced was either sort out a once-a-century constitutional crisis, respect the referendum and have the country move on with a new agenda, or have Jeremy Corbyn and a second referendum, which I thought would be absolutely catastrophic for the country. That's why I got involved with it in the summer. I thought that I could help solve that problem. And I do think, one way in which this could have been even worse than it was, if you imagine that Parliament of 2019, that hung Parliament, if you imagine that Parliament colliding with this disaster in January 2020, God only knows what would have happened. At least here, this is not a comment at all on Brexit. Reasonable people can agree or disagree about Brexit, and it's perfectly reasonable to have the view that, we should have, Remain should have won and whatnot. I don't want to get into that whole thing. But if that broken Parliament had limped on into 2020 and confronted this crisis, I think we would now be looking at. Frankly, I think the whole system would have melted down and fallen apart.
Sure, but I mean, did COVID essentially stop what you wanted to do, achieving number 10 from happening? Is that a fair assessment of, because you had obviously a lot of designs on reforming Whitehall and reforming number 10 itself?
I'd say it's hard to say. In some ways, the COVID stuff accelerated a lot of the things that I wanted to do. One of the big arguments I made was that civil services got to reform and it doesn't have the right skills in place. I think that's now obvious. I said that science and technology should be the centre of the agenda for the British state in the future. And I think that things like the vaccine task force show both in a defensive and sort of positive building sense what the science and technology agenda could do. So I think, it's a very big question. You're kind of hypothetical about how the world could have worked out differently. I'm not sure to what extent the committee wants me to get into broader comments about the political scene. I'd be happy to come back in the future and talk to you about broader questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much indeed, Aaron. Well, it's been a long first section, but I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I think we've learned a lot, and I'm sure the further sections we can be a bit more brisk. I think one of the things we've learned is that, I think as you just said, Mr. Cummings, everyone, wherever you were in the world, was looking through a glass darkly at this phase of the pandemic. And whether we call it flattening the curve or herd immunity, as you said, this is a semantic question, but we were embarked on a policy which doesn't require fancy modelling. If you just look at the figures, if you've got an adult population of 60 million people, and if 2/3 of it get COVID and 1% of the people that get it die, then you've got 400,000 people going to die.
Check 1, 2.
And
hello
that
there,
logic
everyone.
was there, didn't require the imperial model to be published. It was there from the beginning.
Yes.
And yet, SAGE, for 6 weeks from the beginning of the pandemic until these events of the 13th and 14th of March, was recommending the
So I
strategy
just wanted to break
of,
into the stream
let's call
very
it flattening
quickly
the curve.
here. I don't really want to talk over this because it's
this wasn't
been
changed
really
until a kind of epiphany.
Yeah, Prime Minister's
that
questions it was
weekend.
meant to be on at
Now,
12.
Either this was because there was a group
I
thing.
currently have no idea
SAGE
how long
amongst
this
the
committee meeting is going to go. I
advisors,
thought this would be finishing
that
at 12 in time
you
for
were
Prime Minister's
part of,
questions.
which is ironic because
It's
you've
looking
been a
like
great
we're
critic
pushing right
of
up to the
groupthink.
limit. So
Or you knew what was
what I'm
going
going
on.
to do is I'm going to let this
but
play
felt
on.
to
I want to make sure
Julia,
I've got this whole
notwithstanding the fact that you
sitting
were
streamed and recorded.
chief
So I don't want
advisor,
to
then a very senior
cut this
person,
off early.
You felt too junior to.
We'll stick with this.
To call it out.
As soon as this
Which
committee
of
meeting
those
is finished,
two
we
is
will
it, or is it a
head to
combination
Prime
of
Minister's
both?
questions and restart that.
It's a mix, as I
behind
said. So I think
TV and hopefully catch
there
up
is
at
no
some point.
doubt that SAGE
So let's get back
and
to
the Department
Dominic
for
Cummings
Health
giving his
and
evidence
the
to
Cabinet
the
there was a
various
general
committees.
groupthink problem, which was there is no alternative to either single peak, herd immunity by September, or try and act now, which probably won't work, but even if it does, will lead to a second peak in the winter, which will be even more catastrophic. So you're completely correct. The basic numbers of it were obvious, and it was obviously going to be terrible. But the argument was, terrible as that looks, it's better than the alternative. Because if you have the second wave in the middle of an NHS crisis in the winter, then it could be twice as bad as that or 3 times as bad as that. The fundamental groupthink problem was being trapped in the idea that there was only a choice between herd immunity by September or herd immunity by January. Whereas in fact, the right way of looking at it was we can avoid both. And that's what that stupid graph that I drew on the 13th on the whiteboard the Prime Minister's office was trying to do. You push up the line of the NHS capacity by build and all sorts, and you manage a kind of wiggly line along below. But until we started to discuss that around about the 12th, 13th, nobody in government thought that anything like that was possible. Bear in mind, even on the 18th and 19th, after the SAGE meeting on the 18th, bear in mind, at the SAGE meeting on the 18th, it wasn't unanimous in SAGE then that we should lock down. When Demis Hassabis came in at my request, I asked Patrick Vallance to bring him in, and Hassabis laid out his numbers. You know, he's one of the top data science AI people on the planet, if not the top one. People in SAGE argued with him and said, you're being too simplistic about all of this. And then Tim Gowers, the Fields medalist at Cambridge, said, no, that's not correct. Demis is right about this. But that was, to be fair to the PM, the scientists were still arguing about that at SAGE on the 18th. And after that meeting, very senior officials of the Department for Health said, we don't understand what people are now talking about with this possible Plan B, because after we come out of lockdown in a month's time, it's just going to come straight back up again and we're back to square one. So why the hell would we do that?
But you were a person of significant influence, and you later on began to realise the consequences of this.
Yeah.
But what you've described, you're like a whistleblower in effect, but did you forget to blow the whistle?
No, I wouldn't describe myself as a whistleblower. I think that's not the right term. It's true that I kind of hit the panic button. It's true that I hit the panic button and said we've got to ditch the official plan. It's true that I helped to try to create what an official plan was. It's also true that in retrospect, I think my own personal view, I mean, the people who think that we should have stuck with the original plan will say that it was a disaster that I interfered with it. I think it's a disaster that I acted too late. The fundamental reason was that I was really frightened of acting. You know, if you've got an official plan, you've got all the sage advice, you've got the Cabinet Office, the Cabinet Secretary, everyone saying, we've got to do this, and if we don't do it, and if we try and do something different and stop it now, it's going to be many times worse in the winter. I was asking myself in that kind of 2-week period, if I hit the panic button and persuade the Prime Minister to shift, and then it all goes completely wrong, I'm going to have killed God knows how many hundreds of thousands of people. And that's why, essentially, you know, I don't know if I did the right thing or not in the end, but that's essentially why it was the combination of Warner, Gowers, Hassabis, who were, each of whom is 1,000 times smarter than me, looking at the official documents and just saying, everyone has completely lost the wood for the trees in this whole thing. It's not complicated, Dominic. Forget all these complicated models. Do everything you can to pull the system to act as soon as possible. It is actually just that simple. That's what you should do. But I only had the confidence to do that once I knew that people who were much smarter than me had looked at it and said, basically the SAGE groupthink is wrong, the DH groupthink is wrong, we've got to change course. And as I say, I apologise for not acting earlier, and if I had acted earlier, then lots of people might still be alive.
I don't want to diminish at all the contribution of those people that you listed, who are brilliant people and they performed important public service.
Okay, sorry to break in here, everyone. That is 12 o'clock now. I believe Prime Minister's questions has started in the Commons chamber.
Civil servant.
We're going to stick with the Dominic Cummings meeting for now. As soon as this finishes, we will be over to the House of Commons for Prime Minister's questions.
Well, I wouldn't put it
stick
quite
on
like
the
that.
channel.
I mean, it's true that
stick with us here for another as long as this is going to take.
As
soon as Dominic Cummings finishes answering questions, the stream will go down for 30 seconds and it will come right back up with Prime Minister's questions live. So stick on the channel. If you need to subscribe so you definitely know you won't miss the Prime Minister's questions streams live. And yeah, going back there, it seems like it's just a very, very busy day for politics today, which is always good.
I think something has gone catastrophically wrong, and I've come here to tell you and the Prime Minister that. And that was, like, roughly speaking, 7 or 8 p.m. on the Friday the 13th. I think she deserves huge credit for that, and that was another kind of thing that gave me the confidence the next morning to say to the Prime Minister, something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. Like, I don't know what or how exactly this has happened, but it's clear that there's just something gone wrong in the wiring of the system.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a fascinating session. We're going to adjourn now for 15 minutes.
That's it. There we go. So let's get right over to
with Jeremy Hunt in the chair for the next section. Order.
Okay, everyone. So, Steve here. Where is my camera here? As I said, the stream's going to go down for just 30 seconds just now while we switch over to Prime Minister's questions. Stay on the channel. Keep a look for the notification. We'll be back very,